Hi everyone, welcome to Mr. Crime and Sleep. I know some of you can't sleep, so let me keep you company tonight with a chilling true crime story. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where are you listening from, and if you enjoy these nightly stories, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. Now let's dive straight into the story of the killer who hunted his neighbors at night. Imagine living in a quiet suburban neighborhood where the biggest worry is mowing your lawn on time or keeping your dog from barking too late. Now picture this, while families slept peacefully in their homes, one of their own, a friendly face they waved to in daylight, was secretly stalking them under the cover of darkness. He didn't just watch, he hunted. What started as strange noises and missing pets spiraled into a nightmare no one could escape. This is the chilling story of the man who turned his neighbors' trust into his weapon and their homes into his hunting ground. By all outward appearances, he was the kind of man everyone wanted living next door. The sort of neighbor you could rely on when your car wouldn't start. The kind of person who would shovel your driveway without being asked or lend you a tool from his garage with a friendly smile. People described him as helpful and polite, the quiet man who minded his business but was always there if you needed him. He waved at children playing on the street, nodded respectfully at parents, and exchanged weekend small talk while watering his lawn. In the daylight, there was nothing unusual about him at all, and maybe that was the most unsettling part. Behind that carefully constructed mask of normalcy, though, something darker was stirring. While his neighbors laughed together at barbecues and block parties, he wasn't just chatting idly, he was observing. He had a mind like a ledger, noting down patterns, cataloging every detail. Who always left for work at 8 a.m. sharp, who forgot to lock their back door, which families kept their porch lights on at night, and which didn't. He learned the rhythms of the neighborhood, like a hunter studying a herd. Every smile he offered, every nod of friendliness, was just another way to blend in, to make sure no one would ever think to suspect him. He became particularly skilled at disarming people with small acts of kindness. He offered to carry groceries for elderly neighbors, volunteered to help fix leaky faucets or mow overgrown lawns, and was the first to arrive when a branch fell across someone's driveway after a storm. These gestures weren't random, they were investments. Each one bought him trust. Each act convinced people that he was safe, that he belonged, that he was in fact a friend. By lowering their guard, he ensured that when the time came, his movements would go unquestioned. A man that kind, that helpful, couldn't possibly be dangerous, or so everyone believed. At night, when the neighborhood settled into silence, he came alive. While families drifted off to sleep in the comfort of their locked homes, he was outside, moving quietly, testing the borders of what he could get away with. Sometimes he simply walked, dog leash in hand, projecting an image of harmless normalcy even at odd hours. But his eyes were always scanning, always watching for opportunities. A window cracked open just enough, a garage door left unlatched, or a set of curtains not fully drawn. He wasn't simply wandering, he was memorizing vulnerabilities. Neighbors often spoke about how comforting it was to see him out and about at all hours, claiming it gave the impression that someone was keeping watch over the street. In reality, they had handed him the perfect alibi. He had crafted an image of himself as the protector of the block, the man who noticed when something seemed out of place. Ironically, he was the very reason things were out of place to begin with. The frightening thing about predators like him is that they don't announce themselves with obvious warning signs. He didn't dress strangely, didn't isolate himself, didn't behave like the creepy neighbor children whispered about. Instead, he was approachable, ordinary. In fact, he seemed almost too ordinary, so perfectly crafted that in hindsight, people wondered why they hadn't noticed. The truth was simple. No one wants to believe evil can look like someone who smiles at you from across the fence. Over time, his knowledge of the neighborhood became frighteningly precise. He knew which families had security systems and which didn't, which parents stayed up late watching television, and which households went dark by 9. He learned the schedule of the mailman, the trash collectors, and even the habits of local pets. It was like he had built an invisible map of every movement, every routine, every blind spot. His neighbors thought of their homes as private sanctuaries, but to him they were open blueprints, puzzles waiting to be solved. The most disturbing part was how easily he blended his reconnaissance into casual conversation. Over beers at a cookout, he'd casually ask if someone ever worried about leaving their windows open at night. While helping a neighbor fix their fence, he might comment on how quiet the house felt when the kids weren't home. No one thought twice about these remarks. They seemed like normal observations, friendly banter between neighbors, but every word he spoke was a test, every interaction a way to gather more information without anyone suspecting a thing. There was also something almost ritualistic about the way he walked the neighborhood after dark. Some nights he didn't attempt anything at all, he just watched. He'd linger near the shadows of streetlights, pausing to listen for the faintest sounds from inside homes, a child's laughter, the clinking of dishes, the muffled drone of a television show. To him, these were not just noises, they were signs of life, reminders that his prey was real, breathing, and entirely unaware that someone was circling them. He savored the control it gave him, knowing he could approach closer than anyone imagined, stand on the edge of their safety, and walk away without leaving a trace. What made him truly dangerous wasn't just his patience or cunning, it was the pleasure he took in the double life he lived. By day, he relished being seen as dependable, trustworthy, even admired. At night, he reveled in the secrecy of his hunts, in the knowledge that he held a power no one else could even conceive. It wasn't about theft or money. It wasn't even initially about violence. It was about the intoxicating thrill of control, the satisfaction of pulling strings no one else knew existed. And while the neighborhood slept under the illusion of safety, he was already escalating. Each night, he pushed a little further, tested a little more. He started with unlocked sheds, garages, and porches, slipping in and out without a sound. Then he moved closer to homes, brushing against the boundaries of personal space, standing by windows, jiggling door handles, peering into living rooms where families watched TV, completely unaware that just outside, someone was studying every detail of their lives. No one suspected him, because no one could imagine that the man who smiled at their children, who fixed their broken gates, who watered his lawn just like everyone else, was also the one orchestrating the fear that would soon consume the neighborhood. To the world, he was still the perfect neighbor, but to himself, he was already something else entirely, a hunter preparing for his first real kill.
It began with whispers. At first, the neighborhood dismissed them as nothing more than coincidences, the kind of strange little happenings that could be chalked up to forgetfulness or bad luck. A missing garden tool here, a misplaced bicycle there. People shrugged it off, telling themselves they had probably left the shed door unlocked or forgotten where they put something. But the truth was that small pieces of their lives were disappearing, and none of them realized they were being taken deliberately, piece by piece. Pets were the next to vanish. A cat that always came home at dusk didn't return one night. A dog that had never once left the backyard was suddenly gone without a trace. Families posted flyers, children walked the streets calling their names, but the animals never returned. People whispered about coyotes, or maybe even thieves targeting purebred pets for resale. The neighborhood wanted a rational explanation, because the alternative that someone among them was taking them was too unsettling to consider. And then came the noises. Residents began to wake in the middle of the night to faint sounds just outside their windows, scraping against the siding, the crunch of footsteps on gravel driveways, a soft tapping, as though fingers were running along the glass. Each time when they mustered the courage to look outside, there was nothing but stillness, just shadows, and the empty calm of the suburban night. Husbands reassured their wives it was the wind. Parents told their children they had only dreamed it. Everyone wanted to believe there was nothing to fear. But deep down, the sense of unease was growing. A few people began to notice that items inside their homes seemed out of place. A chair slightly shifted, a drawer left open, a blanket folded differently than they remembered. At first they thought they were imagining things, or that someone in the family had moved them. No one wanted to admit what these little details really suggested, that a stranger had been inside their homes while they slept. One of the first incidents that couldn't be ignored happened to a young woman who lived alone. She woke one morning to find her front door wide open, the deadbolt still unlocked. At first she thought she must have forgotten to secure it the night before, but when she looked closer she realized the latch was scratched, as though someone had forced it open with a tool. Her belongings seemed untouched, no electronics missing, no cash taken, but there was something disturbingly intimate about the way a pair of shoes had been moved from her bedroom to the kitchen. It was as though someone had been there, not to rob her, but to prove they could enter and leave at will. The police arrived, took a report and left with little more than a warning to keep her doors locked. To them it looked like an attempted burglary. But what kind of burglar enters a home, moves a few things, and leaves without taking anything of value? That detail gnawed at her, and at the neighbors who later heard the story. She wasn't robbed, she was studied. Someone had been inside, not for money, but for something else entirely. Over the next few weeks, more stories like hers began to surface. A couple across the street swore they heard someone walking on their porch at 2 in the morning. But when they turned on the lights, the footsteps vanished into the darkness. Another neighbor found cigarette butts scattered near their back window, even though no one in their family smoked. A child told her parents she woke up to see a man's shadow standing in her bedroom doorway, only to have the adults dismiss it as a nightmare. The whispers turned to rumors, and the rumors spread like wildfire. People began to talk about the Watcher, an unseen figure who seemed to be testing the neighborhood's sense of safety. Some believed it was a teenager playing pranks. Others thought it might be a drifter sleeping in abandoned sheds or lurking in alleys. But those theories failed to explain the chilling consistency. The fact that whoever it was seemed to know the neighborhood intimately, slipping in and out like a ghost, without leaving behind any real trace. There was a moment when everything could have changed, when people might have come together to take the threat more seriously. But denial is powerful, and fear even more so. It's easier to convince yourself that nothing is wrong than to accept that the nightmare you're imagining might actually be real. Families told themselves they were overreacting. Parents silenced their children's concern. Everyone kept their heads down, clinging to the fragile belief that if they ignored it, it would go away. But the hunter wasn't going away. He was testing them. Each intrusion, each disturbance, was a rehearsal. He wanted to see how close he could get, how much he could take, and how far he could push before someone noticed. And when no one did, at least not in a way that threatened him, it emboldened him to go further. Soon he began leaving subtle signs that he had been there, almost as though he wanted his victims to know. A muddy footprint by the back door, a set of keys moved from one counter to another, a strange smell lingering in a hallway, the faint odor of cologne no one in the household owned. These were not mistakes. They were deliberate breadcrumbs, reminders that safety was an illusion, that walls and locks meant nothing if he wanted to be inside. People began to talk about how they no longer felt comfortable in their own home. They double-checked locks, bought motion lights, even left TVs on overnight to create the illusion of wakefulness. But none of it mattered. He had already proven to himself that he could bypass all of it. The locks, the lights, the alarms, they weren't obstacles, they were challenges. And with each successful intrusion, he grew more confident. The fear began to change the neighborhood. Neighbors who once greeted each other warmly now whispered nervously in hushed conversations. Parents no longer let their children play outside past sundown. People began to eye one another suspiciously, wondering if the person next door might know more than they were saying. A thick fog of unease settled over the streets, and still the police had no answer. Looking back, those were the first cracks in the illusion of safety. The first warnings that the perfect little suburb wasn't as untouched by danger as everyone wanted to believe. They were the signs that the predator was no longer content with watching from the shadow. He was making his presence known, inching closer and closer to the people he had been studying all along. And though no one realized it then, every missing pet, every open door, every unexplained sound was a rehearsal for what was coming next. The night when he would finally decide to stop testing and start taking life. The quiet fear that had been creeping through the neighborhood turned into something darker the night he finally stepped from the shadows. Until then, he had been a phantom, heard but not seen, suspected but never caught. That illusion ended in the dead silence of a Sunday night, when a married couple woke to the unnerving sense that they were not alone. At first it was the faint creak of the floorboards that stirred them. They thought maybe it was the house settling, the way older homes sometimes groan in the night. But when they opened their eyes, Their hearts stopped cold. There, in the dim glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains, stood a figure in their bedroom doorway. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there watching. The husband fumbled for the lamp, and in the second it took the bulb to flicker to life, the figure slipped away into the darkness. By the time the police arrived, he was gone. All that remained were wet boot prints, trailing across the carpet, prints that led to the back door, which hung slightly ajar. The couple tried to convince themselves it might have been a burglar who fled once he realized the house was occupied. But deep down they both knew better. Burglars come for money, for valuables. This intruder had come for something else entirely. He wanted to be seen. He wanted them to know. That incident was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, more families reported break-ins, but they weren't the usual kind. Electronics, jewelry, and cash were rarely touched. Instead, drawers were rifled through, personal items moved, photographs taken from albums. Some families woke to find their furniture slightly rearranged, as if the intruder wanted them to notice his presence, but couldn't resist adding a personal signature. It was as though he was rewriting the script of their daily lives, leaving just enough disturbance to make sure they never forgot he had been there. And then came the messages, written in chalk on back porches, scrawled in pencil across garage doors, even once in lipstick on a bathroom mirror. They were short and chilling. I watched you. Nice pajamas. Next time I'll stay longer. The handwriting was jagged, rushed, almost playful. It was taunting, a cruel game meant to break down the last shreds of security people clung to. The police presence in the neighborhood grew, patrol cars slowly circling the blocks, but he seemed to anticipate their movements. He slipped through alleys, crossed lawns, and moved with the precision of someone who knew the timing of every car, every light, every routine. The families realized with horror that he wasn't just showing up randomly. He was targeting them based on the very details he had been collecting all along. One woman reported that her phone rang one night at exactly 2 a.m. When she answered, there was no voice on the other end, just breathing, slow, steady breathing that went on for nearly a full minute before the line clicked dead. When the police traced the call, they discovered it had been made from her own landline inside the house. He had been there that night, inside her home, dialing her from her own phone, all while she slept upstairs. Fear spread like an infection. People stopped sleeping. Curtains were drawn tight. Neighbors who once borrowed sugar from one another now carried baseball bats and kitchen knives to bed. Children had nightmares of a man in the shadows, and parents had no comforting words to offer, because the nightmares were real. The predator wasn't just lurking anymore. He was declaring himself. He was no longer content being a ghost. He wanted the neighborhood to know they were being hunted. The boldness of his intrusions escalated. He began entering homes even when families were awake, slipping in silently while they watched television in the living room, only to leave behind proof he had been in the kitchen or upstairs. A glass of milk poured and left unfinished. A set of footprints in the hallway. A child's toy moved to the middle of the staircase. Each act was deliberate, calculated to sow paranoia. The community tried to protect itself. Neighborhood watch groups formed, residents taking turns patrolling with flashlights, whispering about what they might do if they ever caught him. But the truth was, no one really wanted to. The thought of confronting him in the dark was more terrifying than the idea of hiding, and somehow he seemed to know when he was being watched. On nights when patrols were thick, he stayed away, leaving nothing but silence in his wake. But the moment the patrols grew lax, he returned, bolder than before, as if punishing them for letting their guard down. Stories began to emerge that he was watching from inside the houses for longer stretches of time. One teenager swore she woke up to the sensation of being watched, only to see the faint outline of a man's head ducking down behind her dresser. When she screamed, her parents rushed in, but by then he was gone. What haunted her most was not that he had been there. It was the realization that he had probably been watching her for hours before she woke. People started calling him the Night Stalker, a name whispered with both fear and resignation. It wasn't meant to be sensational. It was simply a description of a man who came alive when the world went quiet, slipping through doors and windows, moving across rooftops and creeping through the lives of families who thought their walls could protect them. He was no longer just stealing objects. He was stealing their peace, their sense of safety, their very ability to close their eyes without wondering if they would wake to a stranger standing over them. The police, meanwhile, struggled. They set up hidden cameras, placed decoys, and tried to bait him, but he was slippery. It was as though he could sense when he was being watched, melting into the shadows before they could close in. Every failed attempt to catch him only fed his arrogance, and with it, his need to escalate. By now it was clear to everyone that this wasn't about burglary or prank. He wasn't motivated by money. He wasn't even motivated by violence, at least not yet. What he wanted was fear. He thrived on it, fed off it, and manipulated it like an artist crafting his masterpiece. The fear was the point, and the more terrified the neighborhood became, the stronger he felt. The taunts grew more personal. Families woke to find notes that mentioned specific details of their lives, what they had eaten for dinner, what show they had been watching, what color pajamas their children had worn. The intimacy of these details was unbearable, because it meant he wasn't just breaking in and leaving. He was sitting in their living rooms, standing in their kitchens, watching them up close, invisible until he wanted to be seen. By the time the first body turned up, the neighborhood was already broken. The predator had stripped them of their illusion of safety long before he ever laid hands on anyone. When the violence finally arrived, it didn't come as a shock. It felt like the inevitable next step in a game he had been playing all along.
The killings didn't begin with a bang. They began quietly, almost softly, as though the predator wanted to ease his way into violence, the same way he had eased into their homes. For weeks he had been playing his game, moving objects, leaving notes, watching families unravel under the weight of paranoia. But fear alone was never going to satisfy him. Fear was the appetizer. What he wanted was complete dominance, the final act where his control became absolute. And when that night came, it was as ordinary as any other. The first body was discovered in the grey hours of a foggy morning. A father of two, a man who had once reassured his family that the so-called Night Stalker was nothing more than a myth, was found lifeless in his own garage. At first glance it seemed like an accident. The garage door was broken, the lock bent from the inside as though he had been struggling with it. But the truth emerged quickly. He had been strangled. The cord from his own extension cable was wrapped around his neck, his body left crumpled near his workbench. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was touched. It was not a robbery gone wrong. It was a message. The neighborhood panicked. For months they had whispered about the possibility of something darker, but now it was undeniable. The predator who had been haunting their nights had crossed a line. No one could dismiss him as a prankster or a burglar anymore. This was murder, and it had happened inside the supposed safety of a family home. The realization sent shockwaves through the streets, every porch light flickering on like a beacon of fear. But the predator wasn't finished. If anything, the first kill emboldened him. Just weeks later, he struck again. This time it was a young college student home on break, living in her childhood bedroom with the posters still pinned to the walls. She had gone to bed after chatting with friends online, laughing, her world untouched by the dread that consumed her neighbors. In the morning, her mother found her lying motionless on the bed, the window pried open from the outside. The marks on her body told the same story as the first victim. Strangulation, quiet, personal, intimate. What disturbed investigators most was that her laptop was still open, the screen glowing faintly as though the predator had stood there watching her type.
waiting for the perfect moment to slip inside. Again, nothing was taken. It was not about theft, it was about control. The satisfaction of entering a life and deciding when that life ended. Word of the second murder spread like wildfire. Families began sleeping with the lights on, some refusing to sleep at all. Men patrolled their houses with weapons in hand, determined not to be caught off guard. Children clung to their parents, whispering that they didn't want to go to bed because they were afraid the man in the shadows would come for them. And through it all, the predator thrived. The fear he had planted months before had grown into full-blown terror, and he knew it. The killings changed the way the neighborhood looked at itself. No longer was it a quiet suburb where nothing bad ever happened. It was a hunting ground. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of movement outside a window became a reason to panic. Neighbors stopped talking to each other the way they once had, no longer trusting the safety of casual conversation. People boarded up their windows, installed alarm systems, bought locks and deadbolts, but it was useless. He had already proven he could slip past all of it. The predator, meanwhile, became bolder. He began to taunt his victims even in the midst of his violence. One family found a note on their kitchen table the morning after a murder, though their house had been untouched. It simply read, "I could have chosen you." Another household discovered footprints leading directly up to their children's bedroom window, but no signs of entry. It was as though he was reminding them night after night that he was choosing who lived and who died. Law enforcement doubled their presence, patrol cars circling the streets like restless sharks. Detectives knocked on doors, asking questions, searching for anything that might tie the crimes to someone in the area. But the predator was careful. He didn't rush. He didn't leave fingerprints or DNA. Nothing tangible that could lead to his capture. He moved like a shadow, a ghost that left only fear in his wake. The third murder broke the last remnants of hope. This time, it wasn't an isolated victim. It was an entire family targeted. A mother and her teenage son, both found dead in their living room, the television still flickering with the late-night news. Neighbors said they heard nothing unusual that night. No screams, no crashes, no cries for help. It was as though the killer had walked silently into their home, taken their lives, and walked back out without leaving so much as a trace. The image of the boy, barely old enough to drive, struck the deepest chord. No one was safe. Not the strong, not the young, not the vulnerable. With each act of violence, the predator seemed to be escalating not just in boldness, but in cruelty. He wasn't content to simply kill anymore. He wanted to break the spirit of the community. He wanted them to know that no matter how many locks they installed, no matter how many nights they stayed awake, clutching weapons, he could reach them whenever he wanted. The killings were not random. They were carefully chosen, designed to spread maximum terror. A father, to show no man could protect his family. A young woman, to remind everyone that innocence offered no shield. A mother and child, to destroy the illusion of safety within the home. Each death was a chapter in his campaign of fear. By now, people were desperate. Families fled to relatives' houses, abandoning their homes altogether. Others begged the police for protection, though the officers were as helpless as they were. The predator moved faster than they could react, his timing impeccable, his presence unpredictable. The neighborhood felt like a war zone, with an invisible enemy who could strike at any moment. What made it worse was the silence that followed each crime. He didn't boast, didn't confess, didn't leave detailed messages explaining his motive. The only communication came in the form of his actions, and those actions were clear. He held the power, and he wasn't going to stop. By this point, the name Night Stalker wasn't whispered anymore. It was spoken with dread, shouted in news broadcasts, splashed across headlines. But for the people living on those streets, the name wasn't just a label. It was a death sentence hovering over them. A constant reminder that every nightfall could bring another tragedy. The escalation to violence had transformed everything. What began as a series of strange disturbances had become a reign of terror, and the neighborhood knew one thing with absolute certainty: he wasn't finished. The hunter had tasted blood, and he would keep coming back until someone stopped him. The question that haunted every resident wasn't if he would strike again, it was who he would choose next.
The community was already living in the grip of fear, but as the investigation grew colder, something darker began to settle over the town. Rumors spread like wildfire, and speculation became as dangerous as the killer himself. Everyone suspected everyone. The husband wondered if his wife might be sneaking out at night. Parents eyed their teenage children with suspicion, questioning late-night walks or unexplained absences. Neighbors who had once shared summer barbecues now refused to even wave across the fence. Fear transforms people, and here it turned the town into a cauldron of paranoia. The killer wasn't just stealing lives, he was dismantling trust, tearing apart bonds that had been built over years. The real weapon wasn't just in his hand, it was in his ability to make everyone question the person standing next to them. Detectives, too, began to feel the strain. Every false lead and dead-end investigation chipped away at their credibility. Residents accused the police of incompetence, whispering that maybe they were covering something up. Some even believed the killer could be one of the officers themselves, using his position of authority to move undetected. The lines between truth and conspiracy blurred until no one could tell the difference. In the midst of all this chaos, the killer thrived. He didn't have to lift a finger to make his presence felt anymore. His silence became more haunting than his crimes. The mere thought of him lurking in the dark was enough to keep people awake, peering out from behind locked curtains, jumping at the creak of floorboards in their own homes. The strangest part was that he seemed to know the rhythm of the community. Weeks would pass without incident, almost long enough for people to believe the nightmare was finally over. But just when the tension eased, just when life began to feel ordinary again, another night of horror would strike. The unpredictability was his greatest weapon, because it meant no one ever truly relaxed. People didn't just lock their doors, they barricaded them. Dogs were bought, alarm systems installed, motion lights fixed on every corner. Yet none of it brought peace. In fact, the added layers of supposed security only reminded everyone how unsafe they actually were. The killer had, in effect, rewritten the town's daily routine. Every choice, from when someone walked their dog to whether they dared step outside after dark, revolved around the shadow of his threat. For the families of the victims, the torment never stopped. They weren't just grieving, they were living in the very neighborhood where the killer still walked free. Each night brought new nightmares, replaying the final moments of their loved one. Mothers held their children tighter, imagining that a single mistake, forgetting to lock a door, leaving a window open, could cost them everything. Some families even moved away, abandoning the homes they had lived in for years, unable to endure the thought of sleeping so close to the place where the killer hunted. Their absence left empty houses and dark windows, turning the streets into hollow reminders of a once thriving community now hollowed out by fear. What made it worse was that the killer was not a faceless stranger. Everyone knew deep down that he had to be one of them. Someone who attended the same church, someone who waved politely at the grocery store, someone who might even sit on the porch during the day and talk about how terrible the murders were, only to slip into the darkness at night. That thought alone made trust impossible. Even the most innocent interactions were tainted with suspicion. Friendly smile might hide a monster. A helping hand could belong to a predator. The killer had taken more than lives. He had poisoned the very fabric of community. And the paranoia took an ugly turn. Ordinary disagreements escalated into accusations. A man who lived alone became the target of whispers, simply because no one knew much about him. A teenager with a habit of wandering the streets at night was suddenly branded suspicious. Police found themselves overwhelmed with tips, most of them baseless, but each one demanding attention.
Every accusation distracted from the real investigation, and every wasted hour only emboldened the killer. It was as if he had set the entire town against itself, orchestrating chaos without lifting a finger. Fear was his accomplice, and paranoia his masterpiece. The nights became unbearable. The silence carried a weight of dread, as though the entire town held its breath at once. The simplest sounds became sinister. The rustle of leaves, the cry of a stray cat, the hum of a distant engine. People began to imagine things that weren't there, shadows that moved where they shouldn't, footsteps that echoed in the stillness. Some claimed they saw him, standing in their yards, watching through windows, only for police to find nothing when they arrived. Whether those sightings were real or born from terror didn't matter. The psychological toll was the same. The killer had managed to make his presence felt even when he wasn't there, turning imagination into a weapon sharper than any blade. Children, who once played freely in the streets, were now locked inside. Their laughter was replaced with whispers about monsters, their innocence stolen by a man they couldn't even name. Parents tried to shield them, but children notice everything. They saw the way their parents double-checked the lock. They noticed the late-night phone calls, the hushed arguments, the way neighbors no longer gathered in yards or shared meals together. A generation of children grew up learning fear as their first language, taught not through stories or warnings, but by living inside the shadow of a killer who turned their world upside down. The media made it worse. Journalists flocked to the neighborhood, eager to capture the story of the killer who hunted his neighbors at night. Headlines screamed about the failure of police, the vulnerability of small-town America, the mystery of a killer hiding in plain sight. The cameras didn't just record the story, they amplified the fear. Families saw their grief broadcast for the world to consume. Every report reminded the killer of the power he held, feeding his ego and ensuring his place as a phantom who dominated headlines even when silent. The truth is, the killer's greatest crime was not only the lives he took, but the atmosphere he created. He didn't just invade homes, he invaded minds. He planted seeds of doubt that grew into forests of paranoia. The damage he inflicted wasn't limited to the dead. It lived in the hearts of everyone left behind. The town became a mirror of his cruelty, reflecting the terror he sowed each time the sun dipped below the horizon. And that was his true victory, because even as detectives worked tirelessly, even as the community clung to the hope of justice, he had already won the most important battle. He had stolen their peace, and peace is something that doesn't return easily, once it's gone.
The trial of the man who had once been nothing more than a shadow in the night became a spectacle that gripped the entire community, and soon after, the world beyond. Courtrooms are often cold, sterile places, but during this trial, the air seemed to hum with the collective tension of every person who had lost sleep during those dreadful nights, every family who had drawn their curtains tighter, and every soul who wondered how close they had come to being chosen by the killer who prowled among his neighbors. It wasn't just a case, it was the reckoning of fear itself, dragged from the shadows and forced to stand in the blinding light of justice. From the moment the prosecution began to unravel its case, the portrait of the killer that emerged was not of some mythical monster or faceless stranger. It was far more unsettling. It was the portrait of a man who lived just down the street, who mowed his lawn like everyone else, who nodded politely at the corner store clerk, who even waved to the very neighbors he would later stalk under cover of darkness. The disconnect between who he appeared to be and who he truly was shook people to their core. For years, psychologists had spoken about the duality of human nature, but here it was in front of them, undeniable and horrifying. The evidence mounted steadily, piece by piece, each one more damning than the last. Surveillance footage caught a shadow slipping between houses on nights coinciding with the murders. Shoe prints matched perfectly with boots found in his home. A notebook discovered in his attic revealed meticulous sketches of the neighborhood, with circles drawn around certain homes and chilling notes scribbled in the margins.
It wasn't random, as some had hoped. He had watched them, studied them, chosen them as one might select prey. The jury, made up of ordinary citizens, sat rigid, some averting their eyes from the images projected onto the courtroom screen, others staring at the man in the defendant's chair with a mixture of disbelief and disgust. Perhaps the most haunting testimonies came from the surviving neighbors, those who hadn't been taken but had lived through the nights when the fear was at its peak. One woman described how she would sleep with her children in the same room, terrified that if they were separated, she wouldn't be able to protect them. Another man, his voice cracking under the weight of memory, recounted how he heard footsteps outside his window at 2 in the morning, only to find nothing when he gathered the courage to look. Yet later, when police dusted the side of his home, fingerprints matching the killer were found just beneath the sill. The realization that the murderer had been right there inches away from entering nearly shattered him as he relived it on the stand. The defense tried to humanize him, to explain away his crimes with stories of childhood trauma, mental illness, and a fractured psyche. They painted him as a man tormented by forces beyond his control, someone who had become a prisoner of his own darkness. But the prosecution countered with cold clarity. Trauma might explain his brokenness, but it did not excuse the meticulous planning, the careful execution, the joy he seemed to take in instilling fear. This was not the work of a man who had simply lost his way. It was the work of someone who reveled in power, who chose to be the wolf in the fold. Day after day, the courtroom filled with journalists, neighbors, and those who had come from across the state to witness the trial that seemed to embody every nightmare whispered in small towns across the country. Headlines splashed his name and face everywhere, making it impossible to escape the grim story. The community that once longed for answers now found themselves suffocated by them, forced to stare directly at the truth they once only imagined. Parents who had tried to shield their children now found themselves explaining why the man who used to wave from his front porch was shackled and guarded by police. When the verdict was finally read, the silence that followed was unlike anything else. It wasn't relief at first. It was a heavy, almost paralyzing stillness, as though everyone needed a moment to let the words sink in. Guilty. Guilty on all counts. One by one, the jurors confirmed their decision, each syllable slamming into the courtroom like a hammer. Some family members of victims wept openly. Others stared ahead, their grief too deep for tears. The killer himself sat expressionless, though some swore they saw the faintest smirk on his lips, as if even in defeat he wanted to remind them that fear had once been his greatest weapon. The sentencing phase carried with it its own storm of emotions. Prosecutors argued for the maximum penalty, urging the court to remember not only the lives taken, but also the countless lives scarred by the terror he had spread. The defense continued their plea for leniency, citing his fractured mind, but the judge, echoing the sentiments of the community, stated firmly that some acts were too cruel, too deliberate, too devastating to be excused by brokenness. Justice, he declared, must be delivered not only for the victims, but for the very idea of safety that had been shattered. As the killer was led away, the community was left to grapple with the aftermath. The trial had given them closure in one sense, but it also left them with a permanent scar. How could they ever fully trust their neighbors again? How could they walk the streets at night without glancing over their shoulders, remembering the man who once did the same, but with far darker intention? Documentaries and books would later revisit the case, dissecting every detail, analyzing every choice, and asking the same question that lingered even after justice was served. How could someone live among you, smile at you, and yet plan your death in secret? For the families of the victims, the answers would never be enough. Their lives had been irreversibly altered, their loved ones gone forever. For the survivors, the memories would always flicker at the edges of their minds, haunting them in the quiet hours. And yet, even amid the lingering shadows, there was a collective vow among the community: never again. They promised themselves and each other that they would be more watchful, more united, less willing to dismiss the subtle signs of danger. Out of tragedy came a painful but necessary reminder: that evil doesn't always announce itself with snarls and fangs. It sometimes hides behind familiar faces, waiting until nightfall to reveal its true self. The story of the killer who hunted his neighbors at night didn't end with his conviction. It lived on in the lessons it carved into the community, lessons that would echo for generations. Safety, they realized, was not just about locked doors and lit porches. It was about vigilance, awareness, and the courage to confront darkness head-on. And though the man who had terrorized them was locked away, his legacy served as a grim reminder that sometimes the scariest monsters are not the ones who lurk in the woods, but the ones who live right next door. Thank you for spending this time with me on Mr. Crime and Sleep. I hope tonight's story of the killer who hunted his neighbors at night kept you company and gave you something to think about as you drift off to sleep. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. It helps this community grow, and it means you'll never miss a new story. Rest well, stay safe, and remember, the night is never as quiet as it seems. Good night until next time.